Hello class, welcome to this lecture, Art and Visual Literacy. Today we're going to focus a lot on active versus passive seeing, and this is just kind of a small lecture. I like to do these mini lectures as opposed to super long, hour-long lectures. The first thing I wanted to mention this week is I wanted to let you know that I'm very open to any questions that you have at this point in the semester, especially because I know that everybody's still kind of getting settled, especially a lot of freshmen are, sometimes it's a bit of a learning curve, getting to know Blackboard. It's this new platform and you're trying to figure it out. So please be sure to email me if you ever have any questions about Blackboard, about the platform itself, about quizzing, about accessing these lectures, anything like that that you need help with, please let me know and I can definitely help you out. So here's the outline for this lecture. First of all, I wanted to ask you if you had questions. There you go. And then we're basically going to do a reading overview with by specifically looking at this idea of passive and active seeing. Okay, I'm going to talk about different modes of seeing as well. But the first thing that I wanted to do right now, and the reason why I kept that introductory slide on for a minute or two, is because I am interested right now in doing an exercise with you. Even though you're not here with me, hopefully it's useful for you to at least answer some of these questions. So if you were here and I were actually in class with you, I would have you try to think about what the images on the board were before I started class. Well, I guess here it's a little bit different. So while I was speaking over the first slide, what were those images that were on that first slide? You were probably looking at the screen, right? But how actively were you looking at the screen? Were you more interested in something else that's happening around you? Were you trying to listen more so? These are all really important questions when we think about the difference between passive and active seeing. So if you were in a class with me, I'd ask you, what did you remember? And I actually taught this class in lecture earlier today, and students, probably had a similar response that you would have had you been in class with me. And many of the students said, "Oh, I remember a flag. There was a flag. I remember a pipe." And some of them, if they were really looking, remembered that there was a woman seated in the middle. And any more than that was really, students really didn't have much more than that to say. A few students, one of my students earlier today said, "Oh, I think there was some French writing below the pipe," but that was about it. So really there wasn't a lot of detail that was provided. And I like this exercise because it gets us thinking about active and passive seeing. Anytime that we are passively seeing something, we're not really investigating it, right? We're just we're looking but not actually analyzing or not actually looking closely, even though we do see things around us. Active seeing is a little different than that. Active seeing is when we actively look at something and engage with it in some way. We look for deeper meaning within something. We critically gaze at something and are really thinking about it, trying to pick up as much detail as possible and thinking about the context and implications of such an image. So these are two different ways of seeing. Here are the three images, just for your reference, that were up at the beginning of class. So yes, we do have a flag on the left side. We do have a pipe on the right side with some French, "C'est un possum pipe." That means this is not a pipe, so we'll talk about that in just a second. And then in the center we have a woman. This is a piece by Michaeline Thomas, a contemporary piece that we will not get to within this lecture, but your book, the author of your book does spend a significant amount of time talking about that piece, and it's actually a pretty fantastic piece. So make sure that you read your book and fill yourself in with all that. So moving on, so there's a couple ways of seeing, right? There's active and there's passive seeing. So you can think about how this happens in your everyday life. And I hope that your discussion post, that you think about this question and that you write down some ways in which you are actively or passively seeing. I'm not going to go into it a lot here because I want that to be something that you think about. I don't want you to just write down what I say in this lecture. So I want you to actually think about it on your way to work today or on your way to class today, whatever you did today. There were instances where you were actively and passively seeing things, and this is just true of everything. So you can think about everything you see, and you probably either see it actively or passively. That is to say that you see it with a critical eye, right, and you actually are trying to look at things, or you're oftentimes wanting to ignore things. For instance, earlier today my students were talking about advertisements, for example. So I hope you don't all just say advertisements in your posts, but I understand if you do have that experience. But things that we actively don't want to see, right? We see those things often passively. We are actively passive about seeing them. So anyway, I'm not going to focus too much on that, but I just wanted to kind of get your brains working on that question as you start to prepare for that discussion. The other part of this lecture, I want to focus on framing and the trompe l'oeil. These are two different processes of seeing that we see often within the study of art. And here at the right-hand side, we have a couple examples. So at the top, we have an example of trompe l'oeil. Trompe l'oeil is a French term, and it basically means tricking the eye. So this is when the process of seeing is informed by trickery. So artists have employed this throughout the history of art, this notion of tricking the eye into seeing something that it's not actually seeing. So the artist, bringing it to the contemporary era, we have a German artist, Edgar Müller, who's working in Berlin and creating these street art murals on the streets. So this is actually on a road, right? It's not actually an Arctic cliff, but it looks like that, right? There's an optical illusion here that allows us to be tricked slightly by it. The image on the bottom exemplifies framing in some ways too. So we'll think more about framing in the next few slides. But here I actually wanted to also bring up another important notion here that I actually forgot to write on this PowerPoint, and that is the process of representation. And this is also a process of seeing. The image on the bottom, this is an important piece, an important French surrealist piece by René Magritte. And basically, as I said before, written in French below the pipe is the inscription that says, "Ceci n'est pas une pipe," which means this is not a pipe. So obviously, we have a bit of a predicament here, right? We've got a painting that is a photorealistic painting, very realistic, in other words, painting of a pipe. Yet the artist has inscribed that this is not a pipe underneath it. So this gets at this important question of representation. What is a representation? What is this pipe, right? It's a representation of a pipe. It's not actually a pipe. So that's why artists, especially at this time, and especially in the Surrealist movement, were interested in the question of representation. They're interested in questioning the object versus its represented double. So in other words, artists are saying, hey, this is an image of the pipe. This is a representation of the pipe, but it will never actually be the pipe. If I had a pipe here and I was showing you a pipe, I could say this is a pipe. But these artists are saying, no. Anytime that we create a representation of something, it is never going to be that thing, because it is created through a frame, through a framework that the artist, him or herself, designs and creates. So the artist created this image of the pipe through a framework that kind of has informed their life. And we'll talk about framing more in just a second. But you can see here that artists are really interested, especially at this time, and Magritte is working in the 30s here in France, but they're interested in the representation as being separate and being very different from the actual object. So the other thing I wanted to, the other exercise that I wanted to do with you regarding framing has to do with looking out a window. So imagine, hopefully when you're watching this, you're somewhere where you can look out a window. So take a moment, look out your window, and think about what you see. Take a moment. I know you can't respond to me, of course, but hopefully you would say, so for me, I'm looking out my window and I see trees, I'm at my home, so I see a car, I see my dog outside, I see the neighbor sweeping the street because that's what he does all the time. So basically, you're going to see a lot of different things through that window, right? But I would never, I doubt that any of you, when you were thinking about what you were seeing, I doubt any of you would actually say that you saw the glass of the window, right? Because that's the frame. It's kind of like how we see the frame. So the frame and framing itself is basically, this exercise helped us to think about the fact that we never talk about that window that is in front of the world outside. But nonetheless, we see everything outside through that window, through that frame, even if we don't consciously realize this. So, in other words, the frame is basically a set of biases, pre-assumed assumptions about the things around us, the ways that we've been raised, our values, our morals, the things that we believe in. All of these things frame our surroundings and the way that we see the things around us, so that each of us will see something in a different way. And I like to introduce this idea of framing in a class like this because it allows us to all have very different opinions, and that's okay. So in discussion forums, make sure that you're being courteous to others, because it's likely that you'll have a different way of thinking about an image or a painting or a sculpture than one of your classmates. And this is because we all see the world through separate frames. We all have a frame that we've cultivated throughout our lives based on a bunch of different factors, right? And so here, this is kind of my fun way to get at that frame, right? You never see the glass of the window, even though it informs everything that you see outside, right? It is something you see through, and this is the way that we function in our everyday lives as well. Our perspective is something that frames the way that we see the world around us. Okay, so framing, for example, if we're talking about a certain artwork, I like to use Faith Ringgold's God Bless America #13 piece to think about framing. So we've talked about the flag a little bit in the last lecture, and we're going to talk about the flag again in just a moment. But here I think it's important to think about historical context with this piece. So if we frame this piece within its historical context, we see that it's actually, its context is very important to it. So it was created during the Civil Rights Movement. Faith Ringgold is an African-American female artist who was working in the 60s and 70s especially. And she was really concerned with racism in the legal system. And this was actually a very prominent problem in the within this context in the 60s and 70s. And so what she's done here is use the flag to represent kind of the justice system here, but the flag has become kind of bars, like prison bars, for this woman who kind of looks through these prison bars. So here we have the artist who's referring to the flag but not actually representing the flag. And the star over her chest, right, this is kind of like a badge, but also a symbol of the flag. So here she's using the flag to kind of get at these core issues in America at a time when the legal system was absolutely engaging in racist conduct. And this is something that the artist was very interested in because she wanted to think about her contemporary surroundings, and that's what was going on in her life at the time. So that's a little bit of framing. The other way that we see the world around us, and the other way that artists have often tricked us into seeing things differently, is through the trompe-l'oeil. And we've talked about this just a moment ago, and there's a couple of different ways that artists use trompe-l'oeil. One is is exemplified here by Richard Haass on the left side, and this is kind of a very obvious kind of rendering and use of trompe-l'oeil, basically literally tricking our eye. And then the image at the right is Jasper John's flag. We've already talked about this piece, but we're going to use it again today to think more about kind of a more subdued way of tricking our eye. So Richard Haass is an artist, a muralist who you see painted here the outside of the Oregon Historical Society in the late 80s. And it might look like this is a painting to you, right? But this is actually a building with a mural on the side. And it looks like all of this is architectural elements parts of the building, but if you look closely, it's actually trompe l'oeil. It's tricking us. It's actually painted to look as though it's giving us this optical illusion of this 3D space off the side of the building. And this is nothing new. We see the trompe l'oeil used by artists all the way back to, circa 79 before the Common Era, or I'm sorry, of the Common Era. And many of you probably heard of Pompeii, this ancient city near Rome that was covered in a volcanic ash in the kind of 80s. I guess I would say the 79 of CE, the Common Era. Not the contemporary 80s. That was not the right way to say that. But artists, even this far back, right? This is pretty ancient history. Were interested in tricking the eye, and so this would have been in someone's bedroom chamber, where the wall would have been painted, or the wall was painted, tricking the eye to believe that there are these amazing Roman colonnades right outside one's window, when in fact this is just a wall that's been painted to look like that. The other way that we kind of see the trompe l'oeil used is in Jasper John's flag. And I want you to, either at this point in the PowerPoint or right after you watch this lecture, I've uploaded a video through Khan Academy. It's kind of a smart history database with art historians talking about important pieces. And I really like these videos, and each week or every other week or so, I'll be posting some of these videos along with the lecture, and these just kind of offer you a different perspective. So I'm posting one this week on Jasper Johns' flag, and I'll put that up, and this will be posted right next to the lecture here. But Jasper Johns tricks our eye in kind of a different way. So rather than tricking us literally, like we've seen with Haass's work and also with René Magritte, here Jasper Johns is really interested in what we've already talked about a second ago, the difference between active and passive seeing. So he's quoted to have said that people often look at the flag and it is often seen but not looked at, not examined. So this is this important difference between active and passive seeing. When we are passively seeing, we see something but we don't look at it. And he's saying that when we actively see something and we examine it. So for instance, here with the flag, when you look at the image on the left, from far away, it just looks like a flag. You might not notice the intricate changes in the flag that Johns has represented here. But then when you look closely, the two images that I've placed here on the right, you see that actually it's not a real flag, right? It's a representation of a flag. It's the artist's rendering of a flag. So is it a flag or is it a painting? And this is a question that they dabble with a little bit in the video that you'll be asked to watch right after this lecture. And so here you can see that, again, we have a frame, a context for this piece as well. It's created in the mid-50s at a time of McCarthyism, which is to say anti-communism in America. It's also the time when we have this really intense space race. This is during the Cold War, too. So there's a lot happening at this time in history, and a lot of people are questioning and rethinking patriotism in America. And so the flag kind of is in an interesting spot within this context. Moving on, I wanted to introduce one more term today to get you guys thinking about how to use the language of art, and that is aesthetics. So aesthetics refer to our sense of what is beautiful, and this varies across cultures and over time. So you probably heard people say, oh, that's aesthetically pleasing, right? Which basically means that's beautiful. That's aesthetically pleasing to me. It's beautiful. It's important to note that Western culture values order, regularity, proportion, and design, and these are all hallmarks seen through classical art and architecture, and these are also, values that we often see as being aesthetically pleasing. And so I think it's important here when we talk about aesthetics to think about how they range and how they change over time. This is the example that I like to use when I talk about aesthetics. So the image on the left, some of you might have seen this in the past. This is the image of a Doryphorus. It's a sculpture created in 440 BCE, before the Common Era. And it's created by a mathematician and scientist and theorist, Polykleitos, who was a Greek sculptor. But he was also a mathematician, right? And so this is the first time in history that we have kind of the ideal proportions of the male nude. So before this, we have, if you think in your mind, if you think about the rigidity of Egyptian art that you might have seen, Egyptian art is kind of part of our pop culture, so we've probably seen a few Egyptian sculptures here and there. And if you think of those, you think of them as being quite rigid, right? There's really not a relaxed form of the body in Egyptian art. But here we have Doryphorus, who was trying for the first time to show how the human body would stand in a relaxed manner. And this is what we call contrapposto. Now, you don't have to worry about those terms necessarily, but basically contrapposto is this kind of relaxing of one side of the body. So you see that the figure is leaning to one side. He's bending one leg, bending one arm, and putting his weight to one leg. Now this is typically how us humans stand, right? There's not many of us who would be rigid, straight legs, straight arms all the time, like a Barbie doll, right? But rather, when we're hanging out in our everyday lives, when we're talking to one another, we stand in this type of fashion. So this was seen as being really naturalistic, really ideal. And in fact, the artist himself was a mathematician, and he created measurements, very specific measurements from Polykleitos, from Doryphorus's foot to his knee, to his hip, to his shoulder, all the way to the top of his head. So the whole length of his body is all intricately planned out in terms of mathematics. Okay, so these are the ideal proportions of the male nude of the human body. So this was seen as being ideal beauty, right? This is aesthetically pleasing to Greeks at the time. But something that I really like to emphasize in this course, when we talk about aesthetics, is that they do change, right? They're different over time and over space. And so here, when we look to the image over on the right, we have Madonna with the long neck by Parmigianino, who's an Italian artist working in the 16th century. So here we have a little bit of different proportions, right? This is from the Mannerist style. You don't have to worry about that quite yet. But this is a style that often thought elongation of the human form was beautiful. And so here you can see the Madonna has a really long neck. It's almost snake-like. Her body is elongated. If she were to stand up, she would be super tall. And look at the Christ child. He looks, he doesn't look like he's in very good shape, right? He's super long. He's almost as long as one of these grown women here. And he's so elongated. His torso is twisted. His legs are elongated. He's kind of in a gray hue, not looking so good. But this would have been, to the Italians at this time, within this style, would have been seen as immensely beautiful. So this is just the way that we see aesthetics changing over time and over space. And that's all I have for you now, just a mini lecture there on aesthetics, visual literacy, and passive and active seeing. I will see you next week, and I'll post a few more lectures then. Let me know again if you have questions, and thank you for listening.